Okay, so we've got this collection of articles and research all about the impact of the sex industry.
Hmm.
Specifically, how pornography, might be affecting us, our relationships, even society as a whole. And I feel like whenever we talk about something that has the potential to be addictive, the first question is always, well, what's actually happening in our brains?
Yeah, you're right. And actually, the science here, it gets pretty interesting. It's not just a quick dopamine rush. I mean, that is definitely part of it. But the research you sent, it points to some deeper mechanisms at play here.
Okay, so walk us through it. What is the science telling us about pornography and how it affects the brain?
So when someone views pornography, it actually triggers this release of dopamine in the brain. And dopamine, well, it's often called the feel-good chemical. It's associated with pleasure and reward.
Right. Yeah, and we see this dopamine loop with all sorts of things, right? Like social media notifications or even like sugary foods. It's like our brain gets a little reward every time we engage in those behaviors.
Exactly. And that's kind of where things get a little bit tricky. You see, the brain is amazingly adaptable, but that adaptability, well, it can work against us. So with repeated exposure to something that triggers dopamine, like in this case, pornography, the brain, it can actually start to become desensitized.
Desensitized, meaning it takes more and more to get that same level of reward.
Exactly. So someone might find themselves seeking out, more intense content, more extreme scenarios, just to feel that same level of excitement, that same arousal that they felt before. They're chasing a high, basically, that keeps getting harder and harder to reach.
And that's where I imagine those potential negative consequences come in, right? Even if we aren't talking about a clinical addiction, like in the same way as substance abuse, it sounds like there can still be a real impact on our behavior, even on our brain structure itself.
Absolutely. And you're right, the research you sent, it points to some potential changes in brain structure, particularly in the areas related to, well, motivation and impulse control, even decision making.
And that's where it gets really interesting because those are the very areas that help us navigate relationships.
Yeah.
To make healthy choices, it's how we function in our day-to-day lives.
Exactly. It's not just about what we see, it's about how our brains are being shaped by it. Like they're potentially rewiring themselves based on our experiences.
So we're starting to see how this goes way beyond just a simple dopamine hit. There's, this potential for rewiring, for desensitization, and that has implications for how we interact with, well, everything around us. And, it's funny, when we talk about our brains being rewired like that, it makes me think about the impact on our relationships.
Oh, yeah.
Like we've all had that experience where a movie, like a romantic comedy or something, it sets up these totally unrealistic expectations for what a relationship should be.
Right.
And then real life just can't compete with those Hollywood endings,
It's so true. And that's actually something that researchers are really starting to explore, this idea of how pornography, with its portrayal of relationships and intimacy, how that can create this disconnect with the real world.
Yeah, because in real life, relationships, they're messy, right?
Yeah.
Bodies change, intimacy, it ebbs and flows. It's not always, a perfectly choreographed dance.
Exactly. And in the research you shared, it actually highlights some pretty alarming correlations. Like one study, I think it found a link between heavy pornography use and decreased relationship satisfaction over time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like the more someone buys into those unrealistic portrayals, the less satisfied they are with the real deal.
Wow, that's really something. It makes you wonder, what's the root cause there? Is it that the pornography is directly causing the dissatisfaction, or are there other factors at play?
Right. It's that age-old question, isn't it? Like correlation versus causation.
Right.
And unfortunately, it's not always easy to tease those apart, especially in these types of situations. But what we can say for sure is that there's definitely a connection there, and it's something to be mindful of.
Absolutely. And this isn't just about romantic relationships either, right? The source material also mentioned some concerns about how this constant exposure to sexualized content, even if it's not directly pornographic, could be impacting younger generations.
Yeah.
Kids who are still figuring out who they are, how relationships actually work.
That's huge. And honestly, I think that's something that often gets overlooked in these conversations. Like children, teenagers, their brains are still developing. They're still trying to figure out how to process all this information that's coming at them. And when they're constantly bombarded with these hypersexualized images, it can create a skewed perception of what's normal, what's healthy, what to expect.
Totally. It's like this disconnect between what they're seeing on the screen and then like the reality of human connection, of intimacy, of respect within relationship.
Exactly. Exactly. And the research you shared, it highlights some, I don't know, some pretty concerning trends in that area.
But like what?
Well, for example, there's been a lot of talk lately about like the normalization of certain sexual behaviors in media, and not even just in adult content, but even in things that are, targeted towards younger audiences.
So you're talking about like even those seemingly harmless jokes or the way the characters are dressed, or even just like suggestive themes that kids might not even consciously kick up on,
Yeah.
but that are still like seeping into their subconscious.
Exactly, exactly. And the worry is that this kind of constant exposure, even if it's subtle, it can have this desensitizing effect,
Yeah.
It can normalize behaviors that might be risky or even, straight up harmful. And it can create these really unrealistic expectations about sex and relationships.
Yeah, it's a lot for a young mind to process, especially when you consider they're already navigating all the complexities of puberty and social pressure and all the other challenges that come with just growing up. It's like there's this whole undercurrent of messaging, and it's almost everywhere once you start to see it. And I think one of the things that I found most concerning in all this research is how this might be contributing to the objectification of women.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a huge piece of this whole puzzle, and it's something we really need to talk about. The source material you sent, it really highlights this concern about the way that women are often portrayed in pornography specifically, and how that can like spill over into the real world.
Yeah, it's like it creates this framework for viewing women through a very, very narrow lens.
Right.
Where it's all about, their physical attributes and whether or not they're sexually available, and that's really it.
Exactly. And the really concerning thing is that this kind of objectification, it can have these really far-reaching consequences.
Oh yeah.
It can contribute to those unrealistic beauty standards that we see. It can, fuel body image issues, and it can even, some argue it creates this climate where harassment and violence against women it's more likely to occur.
Because if you're constantly seeing these images that reduce women to objects,
Yeah.
it's easy to forget that they're real people with their own thoughts and feelings and experiences and complexities.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's such a crucial point to remember, especially in the context of this conversation we're having.
Yeah.
Like we're talking about the impact of the sex industry and pornography, but we can't lose sight of the fact that there are real human beings at the heart of this.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. This has been a lot to unpack, but it's been incredibly insightful. And I think the biggest takeaway for me and hopefully for our listeners as well is just the need for critical thinking, across the board.
100%. Yeah. We live in a world that is it's saturated with media, and it's so easy to just kind of passively consume it without really, really stopping to think about what we're seeing. But the research that you shared, it really drives home just how important it is to be mindful, to ask questions, to really consider the potential impact of all of this, not just on ourselves, but on society as a whole.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with this question of, if pornography can have this much influence, this much power,
Yeah.
then what responsibility do we have both as individuals and as a society to engage with it consciously and critically? It's a question that I hope everyone listening will continue to explore long after this conversation is over.
Yeah.